Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened.
There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
Good night and good luck.
Hey folks, it's Rick Wilson and welcome back to the Lincoln Project podcast. I have a fascinating guest today. Mickey Bergman has a job that very few people have in this world. Mickey Bergman is the CEO of a company called Global Reach, and he is an expert on getting hostages back from bad places overseas, getting hostages out of dangerous situations where they may have either been put or put themselves. And so he's got a terrific new book called In the Shadows, True Stories of High-Stakes Negotiations to Free Americans Captured Abroad. So with that, Mickey, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I wanted to jump right in with the question that struck me right off the bat. How did you get into this mission, this business? How did you become a person who specializes in rescuing and retrieving hostages?
Well, thank you, Rick, and I'm glad to join you here. So it's funny. It's about 18 years ago. I got a random phone call to my office from one Governor Bill Richardson. And
I knew Bill, yeah.
It went, is this Mickey Bergman? It's like, yeah, it's Governor Bill Richardson. I need to pack your stuff and get yourself to Santa Fe. You're coming with me to Khartoum. And I, not only did I not know Governor Richardson at the time, I didn't know the man existed. And I had about 48 hours to figure out whether this is an opportunity of a lifetime or the biggest mistake I make before my head gets separated from my body, because I am Israeli born. I was not an American citizen yet at the time. Mm-hmm. And for me to go to Sudan could have been very, very high risk. So yes. My wife and I decided that what we're going to do is that I'm going to, out of respect, fly to Santa Fe, meet the governor, and then bow out nicely from the mission, which is what I intended to do. And I went over there and I sat, we had lunch, the small mission. And then I said, hey, Governor, I need to talk to you. You know, not only am I Israeli, I'm an officer in reserves. If things go bad, they go really bad. I don't want to risk the mission. And he just looked at me. He says, Mickey, no. I vouch for you. You're coming with me. That's not a thing. And then he laughed and he said, do you know what I'm famous for? I said, what is that, Governor? He said, I get people out of jail. So worst comes to worst, you spend a couple of months in a Sudanese jail. Think what it will do to your career. And he was like, and my wife tells the story that the next thing she heard is me on the cell phone with engines, jet engines in the background saying, I have to go with this guy. And I went. And you know, Rick, it's for anybody who has ever tried to play the game of golf, one time, you swing and you connect and you hear that sound and it both flats out and you're hooked for the game. You always chase that feeling. That's kind of how it felt.
So you went with Richardson to Khartoum, and you were successful in who tell us the story of the case.
So that was actually it was not a return. This was not to negotiate the return of a prisoner, even though we did negotiate over the return of an American journalist. But in this one, it was actually an attempt to get a unilateral ceasefire from President Bashir at the time. This is 2006. This is at the heydays of the Darfur genocide.
Right.
And we saw there from Governor Richardson was something that just never occurred to me is possible, because even though he was governor at the time, he went as a private citizen. He had no authority. And he was able, with his relationship and with his way of making a contact with the president of Sudan, who was responsible for genocide, to convince him to do this unilateral ceasefire that will allow the rebel groups to have a political unification conference that then will allow them to negotiate. And some of the things that he did there, the tricks, the little things that I saw that he did, just blew my mind. And since then, I've been studying him, with him, doing this for 17 years until he passed away, unfortunately, last year.
I was going to say he recently passed. So when we hear stories of Americans being held abroad, I think it falls into three buckets. And maybe you can clarify this for me. One seems to be the ideological types of groups, Islamic State, that are holding either American hostage or other hostages to try to get a political outcome. The classic being the Iranian hostage case. Their second seems to be that some countries have this as a fairly robust industry to literally just make money. It's like a business in some countries. And the third seems to be kind of a combination, like Russia seems to be in a little bit of both of those camps. Talk to us about why people get kidnapped and held hostage in other countries, and what are the differences in the motivations for the hostage takers?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I also divided into three groups, but they're slightly different. So let me go through this. The first one is the group of Americans that have been targeted specifically because they're Americans. They served a certain utility in the eyes of the captors. This will qualify people like Paul Whelan, people like Brittany Griner. They are the classic political prisoners. Then there's the second category, and these are Americans who have traveled into these places and maybe or maybe not have done a minor infringement in the local law, or accused of it, even if they didn't do it, but it put them in the system. And once they were in that system, they were treated differently because they are Americans. So it was not a targeted approach. It was more of a target of opportunity. Danny Fenster, for example, in Myanmar, the Jewish journalist from Detroit, was that. He was caught. He was not targeted, but once he was detained over there, they decided, we have an opportunity. Otto Warmbier was not targeted in North Korea. Right. But once he was in the system, they realized that they could escalate it. So that's the second category. And the third category are Americans who have done something wrong in a country. They've been treated actually equal to another national that would do the same thing. And yet the conditions of their detainment is just unacceptable by American standards. And we still need to figure out a way how to make sure that they don't die in prison or that they get treated well. And each of these categories or each of these buckets are very, very different. But there's one thing that is important. You asked the question, why are they being taken? There's a lot of misconceptions about this. As for most of us who are never being touched by the issue, we always assume that the American actually did something wrong. Right. Because, why else it would happen? Because we're so used to a system that has due process, that you have a rational system. And look at the Americans that were held in Venezuela. Currently, there are not any Americans because we got them out last December. Some of them were actually taken in Colombia, not even in Venezuela. They were trapped in Colombia and basically seduced near the border, and then were taken. Taylor Dudley, who ended up in Russia, and we got him out a year and a half ago, he was in Poland. He never intended to travel to Russia. There's a lot of cases like that. And if you look at it, especially the repeat offenders, Iran, Venezuela, China, these are also, unsurprisingly, the countries that are most sanctioned by the US.
Sure.
And one might look at it, not to justify it at all, because I don't justify the practice at all, but from their perspective, they might look at it as a way to communicate with us. So, for example, if the Russians are unhappy with a certain way that we implement a policy, let's say the Foreign Agents Registration Act in the United States that we've started deploying on Russian media outlets,
right?
Then because we don't have collaborative or productive channels with the Russians, they might start picking up journalists in Russia under their own FARA Act in order to communicate that they're unhappy and they want a revisit of this issue. There's very, very specific reasons sometimes to do that.
So let me ask this question. The Russia deal that was just completed by the White House and a multilateral group of American allies throughout Europe, that seemed to me to be on the high end of complexity for a deal like this. It seemed like a lot of moving parts to make it happen. What was your assessment of the deal and the process that was achieved there?
Yeah, so you're right. It was one of the most complex deals that we've seen. And I commend the administration for being able to do it, because it pulled up. It's not only the White House, State Department, CIA was involved, 7 countries with prisoners, and then other countries that were brought in to help with the trust issues in between.
Right.
Facilitate this. Very, very complicated. over the last several years, and we've worked with several of these families over time, and we continue to work with those who are left behind in
Right.
Russia, and there are quite a few of them. We knew quite a while ago what Putin wanted. The high, the top-
GRU assassin.
exactly right. Now he was
Right.
not held under American custody, so
Right.
by default, this deal had to be done multinational.
Right.
There was no other way to do it with its complexities, and we knew what it was. And there is a sense that the bigger the deal, the more nationalities involved, the bigger the number of prisoners, the more politically feasible the deal is, because you can't say, "Oh, you replace Victor Put for Brittany Griner." We don't know who replaced. It was just a large deal. So politically, from domestic perspective, it is more feasible that way. It's also way more complicated to conduct it. But Rick, there was something that is, even though we knew what Putin wanted, for quite a while, we also knew that Putin didn't want to do anything that will make President Biden look good in an election year, when his prediction was that Donald Trump is going to walk the elections.
Right.
Now, that changed when President Biden stepped aside on two fronts. One is he's not running for president anymore, so he changes the calculation both in Washington and in Moscow for this. And second, it wasn't clear anymore that Donald Trump is going to walk through elections. Actually, it's very doubtful right now. And so you can imagine that from the Washington side of things, President Biden has recommitted himself and made it very public that he wants to do everything he can in the time he has left to bring as many Americans as possible. So he was willing to flex muscles that under a presidential campaign maybe would have been a little bit more constrained. And more importantly, for my assessment, is that President Putin looked at it and said, wait a minute, I might not have the results that I'm hoping for in November. Maybe I do the deal now so I can get what I can right now.
Right.
If it's Kamala Harris winning, not Donald Trump, I might not get that deal.
Right. So I've been fascinated by this, by the like I said, the level of the number of moving parts, the multilateral nature of all the deals. So, but most of these negotiations are much more small scale, right? They're much more intimate. Like if you are brought into a case where you're going to help bring somebody out of China or Russia or whatever it is, with a political overlay, do you end up liaising with our State Department? How does that work? How do you become the person who is empowered to negotiate and get someone out of captivity?
Yeah, so that is a very important point. So we are a non-government, non-for-profit organization. We work on behalf of families at their request at absolutely no cost to them. We refuse to take money or donations from families during or after. We raise our funds elsewhere. But that's why our mandate comes strictly from the families, and we're like horses with blinders. The only thing that we do is to get the people home, which is very different than any government officer, because their agenda is much more complex. Not because they're bad people, not because they don't want to bring Americans, but because it's way more, the agenda is much more robust and more complex. That gives us an advantage. Even though we're not government and we don't have leverage, we can't release people, we can't unfreeze assets, we can't do any of these things. But we can sit with our counterparts and we go directly to the captors and we're able to have informal conversations with them and keep the issue insulated on the prisoners, humanitarian thing, develop what we refer to as the theory of return, which is the script, the story, the shortest path in which a hostage or a prisoner can come home, and experiment with things that officials cannot. Diplomats cannot sit with the Russians and throw out ideas in the air because everything is considered negotiations and they're accountable to it. We can, and we do. And we do it with Iran, we do it with Russia, we do it with Venezuela, even do it with Hamas when needed. And then when we're able to refine and define what a pathway like that looks like, then, Rick, we have the even more difficult task, which is convincing our own government to go ahead and do it. And that And sometimes our negotiations with our own government are more complex than the captors.
Interesting. So there is a perception, I think, among many Americans that hostage takers are the ideological hostage takers are driven by this like implacable, unmovable, hatred of America. They're going to hold these hostages. They may kill them. Are they more rational actors than we think? Are they more willing to understand like the consequential nature of what they're doing than we think? Because I'm always fascinated by how sometimes they just seem to let them go. And I know there's a lot of work by people like you in the background, but sometimes it seems like the irrationality is a pose rather than a reality.
And that is an extremely important point, Rick. And actually, it's kind of like the real reason why I wrote my book, because I was hoping to tell the stories of behind the scenes of all these negotiations, Brittany Griner, Otto Warmbier, and stuff like that, which is interesting as it is. But what I found in doing this for 18 years, our enemies, or the people that we perceive as our enemies and the people that we don't understand and don't agree with, very quickly, we like to refer to them as evil or irrational or crazy.
Sure.
The truth is that nobody actually wakes up in the morning saying, "Oh, I'm evil. Let me see what evil I can do today." For each of these people, there's a certain narrative, there's a certain way that they see the world and a certain way that they understand their role in it that makes what they do, they think that what they do is right. Now, I'm not saying it in order to absolve them of any responsibility for all the terrible things that they're doing. And at the same time, we have to get into that mindset in order to understand how we can actually move them. They are rational. I mean, the North Koreans are rational to a fault. Mm-hmm. The Russians are calculated. There is a narrative in the basis of all of this. They're old school diplomats. They play chess. It's astonishing to kind of see that reaction. And yes, we also have some leaders in some of these countries and some of these groups that are very emotional. President Maduro of Venezuela, a very, very smart guy, again, responsible for terrible things that not my issue now to deal with. But when you meet with him, he's extremely emotional. He's very spiritual, and he can be moved on a dime by a conversation. The leader of the military government in Myanmar, the same way, he's a devout Buddhist. Some of the actions he's responsible for has killed tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands of people. But he sees himself as a man of peace, and he has the narrative that explains it. And when you appeal to that, and we were able to create that relationship with him, you find out. I'll tell you a story. When we went on our second visit there in order to pick Danny Fenster and bring him home, in this case, there was nothing asked of the U.S. government. That was just us in an ability of Governor Richardson to connect emotionally with the leader of the military government there in one meeting and create a friendship and a bond enough for him to do us a favor and give him to us. And when we went to pick Danny Fenster out, we didn't know if there will be some kind of humiliating, a grandstanding of like, oh, they'll bring Danny in, there'll be photographers and stuff like that. And kind of we asked, say, by the way, how is it going to play out? Because we were worried about how it plays out back home. And he looked at us and he was almost insulted by the question. And he said, no, that will be disrespectful. He's waiting for you at the airport. You will decide how you play it out publicly. And it's just things like that. And again, another this might be very extreme just to show you that thing. October 20th, so almost 2 weeks after the October 7th attack in Israel, I was actually sitting with an Iranian at lunch, and this is not a diaspora Iranian. This is an Iranian from the regime in Iran, and in a conversation that was talking about, because we still had prisoners there. At some point, he leans in and he says, "By the way, I need to tell you personally." What happened in the music festival on October 7th, that's not Muslim. What they did to these women, that's not Muslim. So you have these moments that you just like take a wait, what? You don't expect that from certain people that you have certain understanding of them, and this is a very low level of humanity, but there's still a level of humanity that you find. And so it's a long way of saying, I don't think our enemies are crazy. They're rational. Some of them are rational to a fault. They also don't see themselves as evil. And so we, on a moral stand, we can pass judgment and we can criticize and we can push for what we want. On a pragmatic way, if we connect with them on a human level and engage with them directly, not wearing flags, not banging on tables, we might be more effective at getting tangible things with them.
How many Americans are held abroad at the moment? Like just a ballpark? I mean, because I was thinking about this while we were talking, and I honestly don't know. I mean, I know of a few cases that are still remaining in Russia, right? There's still a number of Americans in Russia that were not included in this deal. So I'm just curious, like, what's the scope of the hostage universe?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's way bigger than people think. But it also depends on who you ask. In terms of designation, the official designation of the State Department, the numbers I think right now are probably in the upper 20s of people that have been designated. However, the Foley Foundation does a similar process of designation, or did that for quite a while, and they're reporting close to 50 Americans that are being held currently. And there are other people, interesting enough, Trevor Reed's parents and his father specifically, Joey Reed, having gone through this experience, he's completely committed to this, and he's counting upwards of 100. But again, he doesn't have an organizational and research background to look at each of these cases. But look, in Russia alone, we're all celebrating people who came back, and we should. We are working on several cases. Robert Gilman, who is a former American Marine who's been held there unjustly. Andrew Khachaturian, he's a plumber from California. He transited through Moscow before the war in a flight from Los Angeles to Yerevan to see his fiance, and was arrested there. He got 8 years in prison for arms trafficking. He did have a gun with him, but he checked it in the luggage, did all the paperwork, all that stuff. The Russians pulled it out in transit, and therefore claimed that he was in violation of laws. David Barnes, who's an American man from Texas, who was married to a Russian woman, 2 kids. Their marriage was on the rocks. She wanted full custody. The courts in the United States denied her that. She accused him of molesting the child, one of her children. The authorities, the American authorities, investigated, found out that she made it up. She kidnapped the kids, went to Russia. There was a warrant on them. And when he flew to Russia, trying to work with a Russian lawyer to get visitation to see his kids, not to grab them, just to visit his kids, was arrested on the spot in Russia for the same charges of molestation here. Nothing in it, got 20 years in jail. And of course, you mentioned before, Ksenia Karelina, who is a Russian ballerina who immigrated to the United States, was working in a beauty salon in California, and went to see her grandparents who are sick in Russia, was arrested on the spot because they found on their phone that she gave about $50 at the beginning of the war in Ukraine for a Ukrainian charity. She was on trial yesterday in Russia for treason, and she's awaiting sentencing now.
It does feel capricious when you look at a lot of these people, but there are people who put themselves at risk in these countries. I mean, some of these folks that, as you said, they may not be targeted, but once they're in the system in some of these places, it's really tough to extricate themselves from that.
And most of them, even those who take risks and fly to places like Russia, where Americans should not, if they're dual citizens, Iran, even if they're dual citizens, they should not be flying there. People who go to Venezuela or even go to Colombia and visit near the border, you need to be aware, because it seems like, it's a manageable risk, but once it goes bad, there's no recourse.
Right.
There's absolutely no recourse.
What's the most dangerous of these countries? Where would be the number? I mean, my gut says Russia. but that's who I am. I mean, maybe it's somebody else.
I would say Russia right now is probably the most dangerous place to go visit because we're in an active, indirect conflict in a way that, and for Russia, picking up Americans in order to extract significant deals like that, they see it as a legitimate tool of statecraft, as we've seen. So I would say Russia, I would say Iran. Venezuela right now, not as risky, but still I wouldn't recommend it because it can turn on a dime as soon as the bilateral relations or negotiations are not going so well. And recently, after the elections in Venezuela, they're going south. We might end up seeing more cases or renewal of cases. I wouldn't recommend anybody going to North Korea unless you are a humanitarian worker, a part of an agency that is authorized. And even that is still high risk. But the North Koreans have gone after the fiasco of Otto Warmbier. They decided to get out of the business of political prisoners. So even when Americans end up in North Korea, as we had last summer, they don't hold them. They try to figure out how to bring them back. China is complicated, especially if you're active on social media. You have to be very, very careful. But again, some people go not to those countries, but nearby and end up being targeted.
Right. There are, China, if the MSS gets its eye on you anywhere in a couple 100-mile radius, you're probably in trouble. Yeah. So one last question. You mentioned briefly the Israel-Hamas war and the large number of hostages taken in that situation. Can you give us an update on where the hostage taking in that war stands right now?
Yes, and as my accent doesn't tell or doesn't hide, sorry, I'm Israeli born, even though I've been here for 24 years. I can't get rid of the accent. October 7th was huge emotionally, and it's the first time. That was the biggest case that we've had, and this was after Governor Richardson passed away. So I was found myself in the realm of doing this while I'm emotionally attached to it.
Right.
We had to come up with our theory of return very quickly, and it was based on 3 assumptions. Number one, Hamas and Israel don't talk directly, so it had to be mediated, and I've had experience before in mediating between them. Number two, there are 4 countries in the Middle East that can influence Hamas. None of them can control Hamas. Hamas is a very proud, independent Palestinian program, but Iran, Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt can influence them. None of them have any interest in doing favors to Israel. Right. But at least 2 of them, Qatar and Egypt, have a vast interest in collaborating and working with the United States. And therefore, our theory of return was we had to make this an American priority, an American story at the presidential level very quickly in order for the Qataris to take this to Hamas and say, we know you have a war with Israel, but the issue of the prisoner of the hostages is a problem that we have with the US, and solicit proposals from them. And if those proposals are even half decent, and they're never good, Rick, but even if they're half decent, then the American administration would work with the Israeli government to make them as comfortable as possible to execute and implement and execute this deal and get people back. And it worked fantastically well for 54 days. We had over 100 hostages returned within an agreement in this. And here's the sad thing for me, and it's a failure. And by the way, it's always the case. We talk about the successes. Successes are one day. The failures are the 2 years before that. The failure now, until we succeed in Gaza, is that since December, the same deal that is still available now to bring back those hostages from Gaza is on the table. The only difference is that we have less hostages alive. There are 2 cardinal truths that I've learned in doing this for 18 years. Number one, the deals never get better over time. They just don't. We tell ourselves stories, we spin them, but they never get better. And 2, time is the worst thing that can pass for hostages and prisoners. They die, they get sick. There's active violent crime, violent acts in prison, or they might attempt to take their own lives. And so in Israel, one of the things what we're seeing since then is all of these claims publicly that there's back and forth, new proposals. Hamas is denying, is declining this, all of that. Hamas negotiates very different than we do. And it's unfortunate, but it is the way of life. That's how they did the Gilad Shalit negotiation, which was back in about 16 years ago. They held a single Israeli soldier. It takes them a little bit, but once they set the goalposts, they don't move. They simply don't move, and they're okay with everybody dying, including themselves. They won't move, and Bibi Netanyahu knows that. And so nothing in the proposal that has been on the table, it's not a pretty one, but nothing in it is existentially threatening the state of Israel. Therefore, the state of Israel should be strong enough to say yes, to unburden itself from the issue of the hostages, get them back, all of them that are alive, everybody that you can bring back, and then you can live another day to make your decisions of how you want to conduct yourself. If anybody thinks that Hamas is not going to give an excuse in the future for Israel to restart something or to finish something, they're delusional, and I can sell them something. But that's where we stand. It is stuck. The Prime Minister of Israel specifically believes that as long as there are hostages, there's a justification for the war. As long as there's a war, there's no elections. And he can't win elections in Israel right now.
No, he can't. So, Mickey Bergman, I want to thank you so much for coming on the Lincoln Project podcast today. Folks, the book is In the Shadows, True Stories of High-Stakes Negotiations to Free Americans Captured Abroad. It is a fascinating story. Where can folks find you on social media?
I am on X. I'm at Mickey Bergman, and on Instagram, Mickey.Bergman.
All right. Mickey, bless you for the work you do. It's so important in this world. And again, I want to thank you for coming on the show today. And we look forward to seeing you again sometime soon.
Thank you so much, Rick. I follow you all the time.
Thank you, my friend.